So this session is a follow-up to our very first session that we did, which was very creatively called Socialism 101, which is an intro to basic socialist theory and history. And so in this session, we're really just following up and building upon some of the things that we touched on in the first session. This is how things are gonna break out today. The first section, I'm going to give a brief overview of Marxist theory. Then Griffin is going to give a little bit of history of socialist movements. In section 3, we're going to look at some different models of socialism. What does socialism and what can socialism actually look like? And we're going to look at some historical examples in doing this. And then in the last section, we are going to try and answer the question, is Marx still relevant today? And then, as I mentioned earlier, if time permits, we are hoping to do a breakout discussion at the very end. So in this first section, we're going to explore some of the philosophical underpinnings of Marxist thought. The hope is that by introducing these concepts, we can provide a foundation for understanding how socialists and how Marxists interpret the world, and how this interpretation of the world contrasts with the dominant narratives that we hear, not only in the media and in popular discourse, but also in mainstream academia and what we're taught in school. So we're going to look at these concepts in particular. Perhaps you've heard of some of these before, but maybe you're just not quite sure what they mean. Hopefully by the end of this, we will have a little clear understanding of some of these major ideas and concepts of Marxism. So we're going to look at dialectics and dialectical materialism, as well as its opposite, idealism, and historical materialism, and the concept of contradictions, which was written about and developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. This idea that contradictions exist in every mode of production and throughout every time period. So we're going to start off, before we go into historical and dialectical materialism, we're going to look at what is at the root of all of this, and that is dialectics. So dialectics and dialectical thinking is a very old concept, goes all the way back to the Greek philosophers. Maybe you've heard of the Socratic method, using dialogue and this process of back and forth discussion to arrive at a truth. It's about reconciling two opposing or contrasting ideas. In the modern era, this philosophy is most associated with the German philosopher Hegel. He was fascinated by the internal contradictions and dualisms of nature. And one of his major contributions, and the reason he is associated with dialectics, is his concept of the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. When people refer to Hegelian dialectics, this is what they are referring to. And like dialectics itself, Hegel did not invent this concept either, but he refined it and he popularized it. And so Hegelian dialectics looks at nature as a connected whole. Instead of seeing phenomena as isolated parts, dialectics looks at their interconnectedness. Hegel was also a very religious man. We've said that dialectics was about resolving contradictions of nature to arrive at an ultimate quote unquote truth. And for Hegel, this ultimate truth was the manifestation and unveiling of the divine, of God. So just as humans can continually correct their concept of reality through this dialectical process, God becomes more fully manifested, according to Hegel. And so he was probably the most popular and influential philosopher in Germany at the time, perhaps in all of Europe. And this was right around the time that young Karl Marx was coming of age. And the last thing to note about Hegel before we move on is that, like many of his contemporaries and like many philosophers that came before him, he was an idealist. Okay, and in a second, we're going to look at what exactly that means. When you look at philosophy as a whole, you can really fit all philosophy into two great ideological camps. You have materialism and you have idealism. If there's one single descriptor that defines Marxist worldview and distinguishes it from other philosophies, it's that it is emphatically materialist. According to Vladimir Lenin, the philosophy of Marxism is materialism. So, what exactly do we mean by materialism and idealism? And it's important to explain these terms because, like with many other Marxist terms, you will discover that the meanings are sometimes complicated by more recent and modern connotations. So for example, when we commonly hear or use the term materialist, it's associated with material greed and consumerism. And idealism is this notion of, having high ideals and virtue, but that's not what we mean in the philosophical context. So we're going to just look at, what exactly these mean according to Marxists and philosophy in general. And so materialism is the idea that matter is the fundamental substance in nature. And that all things, including mental aspects, including our consciousness, are really the result of these material interactions. For materialists, there's no consciousness that exists apart from the living brain, which is a part of the material body. Material is not a product of the mind. The mind itself is a product of matter. Um, and so ideas that we have and that we act upon are a reflection of the material world that surrounds us. Um, if you attended the previous session of Socialism 101, we looked at a famous quote from Marx where he says that life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. And so an abstract philosophical way of thinking about that is that our being is not it's not some eternal fixed thing. We are shaped by the material conditions we live in. And I think most people get this on an abstract or even on a personal level. But we tend to struggle to apply this perspective when it comes to things like institutions and systems. And so in the previous session, I used the example of a police officer. Um, it is irrelevant whether an individual officer is quote unquote a good person in other settings, or this common refrain that we often hear from apologists, like they don't have a racist bone in their body, or my uncle's a cop and he's a really good person. That's irrelevant when the institution that they uphold is fundamentally racist and shapes the person and their worldview, not the other way around. And so that's just to give a little bit of a concrete example. And so as Marxists, we don't deny that the mind, that consciousness, that free will are real things. What materialists deny is that the thing called the mind exists separately from the body and the material world, which is the important distinction. And so as human beings, we can relate to our surroundings. We're aware of our surroundings, we react to our surroundings, and in turn, our environment reacts upon us. Fortunately, as humans, we have the ability to think creatively, to make generalizations. And so this means that we have the ability to change our surroundings. Um, Idealism, on the other hand, states that the material world is not in fact real, but is simply a reflection of the world of ideas. There are many different forms of idealism, but essentially all of them explain that ideas are the primary, that ideas are primary, and that matter is secondary if it even exists. So it's all very subjective, and at its roots, it's a profoundly conservative worldview, which leads to this sort of pessimistic conclusion that we can never really understand the mysterious ways of the world. All we can really do is interpret it. Materialism, on the other hand, understands that human beings not only observe the world, but that we can change it. And in doing so, we can change ourselves. And so fundamentally, idealism sees history as driven by ideas and those who act upon these ideas. This so-called great man theory of history That great actors are the ones who really drive historical events, whereas materialist worldview sees history as simply the result of material conditions. And so all of this relates to Marx. As I said before, he was a devotee of the philosopher Hegel. Um, Hegel had recently died when Marx was in college. Um, while in university, both Marx and Engels joined a group of radical thinkers who were known as the Young Hegelians. The sketch is actually by Engels, which depicts a typical meeting of the Young Hegelians. They all had very different views. So their meetings were often basically just big debates and arguments. I especially love this picture because there's the squirrel just kind of floating in the top corner. Um, it's a really great observational sketch. Um, but as I mentioned earlier, Hegel was a very devout Christian for whom philosophy and dialectics was a way of reconciling man with the divine. Marx and the Young Hegelians, on the other hand, were capital A atheists. A fun fact about Marx is that when he was in college, he and his comrades almost started a magazine called the Atheistic Archives. Um, so the Young Hegelians broke with Hegel on his metaphysical views, but they kept his dialectical method and turned it on its head. They used dialectics to analyze and critique the physical processes that they saw all around them. And so after Hegel's death, his followers really broke into two camps. There was a conservative right camp, which believed that the dialectic of history had reached its climax, that reason and freedom had reached their most perfect state. And to them, this was embodied in the existing Prussian state. Well, Marx, on the other hand, and the left wing of Hegel rejected this absurd notion. The Prussian state was hardly known for its enlightenment. If there's one thing Prussia is known for today, it's for not existing anymore. So the Young Hegelians were the radicals. Like Hegel, they too were obsessed with religion. Um, they viewed the Russian state as a despotic one, which was based on and legitimized by religion. So their conclusion was that in order to reform the state, you had to limit the influence of religion. And at first, Marx was drawn to this strategy of attacking Christianity in order to undermine the Prussian state. But he later broke with the Young Hegelians. Marx and Engels both concluded that Hegelian philosophy, at least as it was interpreted by their former comrades, was too abstract and was being misapplied as they attempted to explain social injustices. And so he rightly argued that by replacing an authoritarian state like the Prussian state with a secular, liberal, constitutional one, all you would do is just shift these political and social problems to another arena. And so he concluded that it's not religion per se that's the basis of the establishment's power, but rather it's the ownership of capital, the use of technology, of land, of money, and especially human labor to create surplus value. That's what lies at the heart of ruling class power. And so to Marx and Engels, religion, they were certainly no fans of religion, but they considered religion merely a component of this ideological structure of societies, which the ruling class used to obscure social relationships and to obscure this true basis of political power. And so it was during this period when Marx famously referred to religion as the opiate of the masses. Um, this, but this obsession with religion was mainly due to the particular conditions of the Russian state. Marx was an atheist, but his main goal was not eliminating religion. As we just said, religion was an outgrowth of the underlying structure of the state. You could probably say the same thing of the modern day United States. And so I just want to stress that this is not to say that religion itself is bad or that religion and socialism are incompatible. Of course not, just perhaps not in their current dominant forms as they are used by the ruling class. And so just to stick with religion as an example, if you wanted, for example, to overcome and break the hold, let's say on Prussian society, it's not enough to just understand where religion comes from and the origins of this. You also have to recognize and understand that the underlying social and economic structures, especially, are what give rise to this religious belief. And so in order to eliminate religion as it exists in this dominant reactionary form, you have to eliminate the underlying economic structure. And so this was a very novel way of thinking for the period, and not to mention very radical. Um, and Marx and Engels quickly realized that they could apply this kind of thinking and understanding to other forms of oppression like racism, sexism, colonialism. And so they really created this novel alternative theory, um, not only of explaining why the world is the way it looks, but also what people can do to make it the way it ought to be. And so that brings us to another famous quotes from this early period of Marx. Um, Another fun fact about Marx, he actually wrote an entire book worth of articles critiquing his former comrades and the young Hegelians. Um, Marx would have been an amazing shit poster if he was on Twitter. There's a whole book dedicated to roasting just one person, Ludwig Feuerbach, who was another influential young Hegelian. And in his theses on Feuerbach, he wrote, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. So a little bit of daily inspiration. And so that brings us to dialectical materialism. Um, and so this is the Marxist form of dialectics, which emphasizes the importance of real world conditions. So thinking about class, about labor, about socioeconomic relations. The Marxist dialectic is an evolutionary way of analyzing history. The new is born out of the old. Dialectics arises because formal logic has its limits. We know now that things are in a constant state of motion, in a constant state of flux. But this was really a radical idea at the time. Everything that currently exists out of necessity, but at the same time, everything that exists is doomed to perish, is doomed to be transformed into something else, which is in contrast to Hegelian dialectics, which believes that you could resolve contradictions just by thinking about them, by interpreting them in different ways. That these contradictions in material events could be resolved by just analyzing them. So it was a purely intellectual exercise, whereas dialectical materialism, Marxist materialism, was really rooted in the material conditions. And so Marx proposed that, once you've identified these contradictions, the way to resolve them is to address the systems of social organization that's at the root of the problem. And for Marx, as it is for us still today, that problem is capitalism. And so this is what Marx meant when he said that the reason we strive to understand these processes that define our world is so that we can change it. And so finally, that brings us to historical materialism. So this is the concept that really underpins all of Marxist philosophy. It's sometimes called the materialist conception of history. Again, it's the idea that history is the result of material conditions rather than ideas or great acts of singular individuals. And before Marx and Engels, history was really seen as this series of unconnected events. A series of accidents. There was no general explanation for history. There was no internal law. And so Marx and Engels argued that, in fact, human societies and the cultural institutions around them, like religion, like law, like morality, etc., are an outgrowth of this economic system. So the ultimate cause of social change is to be found, not in the human brain, not in the ideas of great individuals, but in changes to the mode of production. And so by establishing that human development depends on this development of productive forces, we could say that Marx and Engels, for the first time, placed the study of history on a scientific basis. And so these are two very common diagrams that you will see in Marxism. The one on the left, just to give a very brief overview, is reflecting again this idea that human society passes through a series of stages that we can clearly discern. Um, that's not to say, or that is to say that in the moment you may not be able to discern the clear break between, say, feudalism and capitalism, but looking back in history we can clearly see these divides, and we can see that each stage is based on this definite mode of production, which in turn expresses itself in these class relations. And again, as I mentioned, if you look at the diagram on the right, we showed this in one of our previous sessions, but at the bottom, the blue part, you have the base, the mode of production. This is the economic system, and at the top in the superstructure, you have everything that is an outgrowth of it. So again, including religion, philosophy, politics, everything that we refer to, as an ideology. And so if you want to further explore this, we talked about this in one of our previous sessions. You can check out the recording of our Myths of Capitalism session, where we looked at the ways in which the forces of production give way to culture. The Italian communist and theorist Antonio Gramsci is one of the preeminent Marxists who wrote about this and explored this. And so we talk a little bit about his life and his writing in that session. But to return back to this session and historical materialism, again, the basic idea that the engine of history rests in, or what drives history, are these internal contradictions. And so this is how historical materialism relates to dialectics. It addresses this question of how these inherent contradictions can be resolved, and how we can move on to replacing them with higher, more enlightened forms of economic production. And so, we could say that Marx's concept of historical materialism is really to socialism what Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection was to biology. It's the mechanism by which these processes, history and evolution, respectively, unfold. And so what Marx discovered or uncovered was that the prime contradiction under capitalism is class struggle. And so the defining feature of a contradiction is that you cannot have one without the other. And I should have given a disclaimer that you might hear our 7-month-old 60-pound hound dog in the background, so I apologize. But you can't have one without the other. So for example, under capitalism, you cannot have a wealthy, affluent class of capitalists, or even a quote unquote middle class, without the existence also of an oppressed and exploited proletariat working class. And so again, for Marx, each economic system or mode of production contains these contradictions that eventually lead to its demise and its replacement by another more advanced stage of economic and social life. And so just to return, when we look at feudalism, for example, the class conflict in feudalism was between the aristocracy, the lords, who controlled most of the land, and this nascent bourgeois class. And so under feudalism, the aristocracy derived its legitimacy, its divine right, from the church and from religion. And so because of this, these lords and aristocrats, they didn't partake in quote unquote vulgar activities like trade and money exchange. They delegated these out, but they still needed to trade their goods that the serfs produce. So these tasks were given to the merchants, this new class of people who were slightly above the serfs, but still not part of the aristocracy. So they were this budding class that came to be known as the bourgeoisie. The word itself refers to the root word burg, which means people who live in a city. And so these, bourgeoisie came to control a sizable amount of wealth. They began to challenge the aristocracy, but they still did not own the means of production, which still lay with the aristocracy and the monarchies. Sorry, the dog is getting very excited. Okay, so where was I? So, this was still under exclusive control of the aristocracy of the church, until, of course, that is, the bourgeois classes rose up. They instigated violent revolutions, as we saw and learn about in this country. The American Revolution, which was very much, a bourgeois revolution. You had landed, quote unquote, aristocrats, landed gentry, who were not happy about having to answer to the crown and the government back in England, and so decided to declare independence. And so again, to return to what we talked about earlier with idealism and materialism, think about how we learn about the American Revolution in school, or in popular discourse. It's always presented as these great ideas. People like Thomas Jefferson, had these brilliant and lofty ideas, and that this is what the revolution was based on. That people were just fired up by these ideas of freedom and liberty. But we can never reconcile this contradiction again between the words that people like Jefferson wrote and said, and the fact that they own slaves, and that capitalism in the United States was built upon slave labor. And so again, this is the fundamental contradiction that Marx also wrote about. The fact that even modern capitalism, is based on slave labor, in the case of the United States and many other countries in the Americas, but also the unpaid labor of women. And so at its root, these are the contradictions of capitalism. And so to summarize, I know this was a very brief, a very high level overview of some very fundamental topics. We will definitely provide some readings, some videos, if you would like to explore these further. I mean, every single one of these could be a session on its own. So perhaps that is a project for future socialist night schools. But just to summarize, dialectics is what pushes us to grasp all phenomena as intrinsically connected, inseparable from the things that surround us, and constantly unfolding, in this historical process. And so contradictions, which drive this process, are, a state of two opposing forces that are simultaneously present and demand a resolution. And so dialectical materialism you can think of as the philosophy of Marxism. This is the philosophical framework, this method of analyzing the material world. And then historical materialism is the science of Marxism, the science of how societies evolve throughout history. History is the result of material conditions rather than ideas. And so according to a Marxist and socialist interpretation, economics and politics are inseparable. You can't separate the two. And so it was through analyzing and critiquing the world that led Marx to these fundamental conclusions that capitalism is inherently exploitative and contradictory, and that these contradictions must be resolved by this unique class that he called the proletariat, or the working class. And so I'm going to wrap it up here. But I guess, the main thing to take away, if this is new to you, is just that, Marxism is a coherent worldview. It's a way of making sense of reality. It's not this, hodgepodge, of ideas that were developed by, people who just hated capitalism. It's fluid, it's open-ended. There have been many different interpretations and ideas about how to achieve socialism. There's no one strict dogma, but it is a coherent ideology, put forth by thinkers and people from all over the world, all throughout time. And in the next section, we're going to perhaps look at some of these. And so while Marx was clear about the fact that capitalism needed to be replaced with a more humane system, um, preferably a stateless, classless society, which they called communism. It's surprising to most people that Marx actually wrote very little about how to actually get to socialism. And so I'm going to hand it over to Griffin, which is what we are going to talk about in the next section.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to be talking about, the history of socialist strategy. And I guess to begin with, as Marx was developing his ideas and sort of deciding if it was religion or, class struggle that made society the way it is or moved history forward, he was looking to what was going on in the world. And, in 1848, there were a bunch of revolutions all over the continent of Europe that sort of confirmed for him that there's this new class. It's very politically important, and it has the potential to run society for the benefit of all. Um, and like Robert said, Marx himself didn't really write much about what sort of political action we should take if we want socialism. But the history of social strategy is people at various times trying to confront reality and decide how to act, right? How to get the working class to take power. So we can go to the next slide. So I'm just going to give some quick disclaimers. In a meeting of 17 socialists, you might have 18 opinions about any given topic, and so this is just mine. Really, we're not living in the United Socialist States of America, so no one has had everything completely right in the past, but it's important to understand how people were right and wrong and why they made the decisions they made. And so in particular, I'm going to try to talk about how various groups in the past related to the state, as in the government, elections, trade unions, the labor movement, the question of how to organize, and other parties, groups like liberals and progressives. And in particular, I'll focus on the time period between 1865 and 1945. Mostly because this is when a variety of different things were tried out, but also when the high point of the workers' movement. And ever since then, things have sort of been in a stasis, and there haven't been as many sort of theoretical breakthroughs in thinking about how do we win socialism. Next slide, please. So we start out with socialism before Marx, which basically consisted of well-off people, whether they were intellectuals or philosophers or scientists or just, the sons and daughters of wealthy people, in some cases, actual royalty. And they looked around at them, the world around them, and they saw a great deal of injustice. And in particular, they saw a lot of injustice in the new factories that were developing with the advent of manufacturing on a mass scale, when lots of workers would be toiling very hard, moving water around or milling something, working with textiles or mining coal. And this was really a unique phenomenon, the concentration of lots of people working in one place, and much to this dismay of these morally upright socialists, these people seem very oppressed. And so sort of drawing on the revolutionary spirit, the ideas around those times. The French Revolution, the American Revolution, those had happened a while ago, and people were talking about equality for all. So there's a general current within society of ideas that says, we should try to have an egalitarian society. And basically, there's two ways that the people who came before Marx thought that that was going to happen. And one of them is the utopian socialists, and then another is socialists who I've called conspiratorial insurrectionaries, although that's not really an official term. But the utopian socialists were people who basically thought, um, and I talked about this a bit more in the Socialism 101 meeting, but we can withdraw from society and plan our own communities. And we can plan them in such a way that everyone shares the work, the children are educated to be good people, and we can have harmonious relations between each other. And it sounds great. And it had, it inspired a lot of people around the world. Lots of people started communes or planned communities, and they sort of worked the land together, and they built, kind of funny looking buildings because people were experimenting with what sort of architecture would produce, the best hearted or best minded person. Um, and then there were the conspiratorial insurrectionaries who, they looked back to the example of the French Revolution and the secret societies, um, and also the modern police forces that were developing, that were always trying to thwart revolutionaries and workers. And they said, in response to the oppressive apparatus of the state, we ourselves, the people who are interested in making a revolution, have to go underground. We have to be very secretive. We have to evade the police. And really, we have to, uh, all by ourselves, overthrow the aristocracy or the new government and run it as a sort of enlightened dictatorship. Um, and so, there's we can understand where both of these uh, tendencies are coming from. The utopian socialists, they were looking to the future. They were trying to plan out what socialism might look like. And they also thought about, what would the individual look like in socialism? How do we make it so that people relate to each other on good terms? And there's, general brotherhood, and people aren't discriminatory and they share things. Um, but the downside of the utopian socialists is that you can only withdraw from society for so long, because you have to raise a lot of money, and eventually people have to go into town to get more supplies, and so it's very difficult to be self-sufficient on a large scale within capitalism, and it's a hard model to spread. And so a lot of these communes that developed, uh, they went out of, they sort of after a decade just petered off. And the conspiratorial insurrectionaries, they understood that the government, the state, was founded upon, military power, police power, um, and that you have to sort of make sure that your own people don't get arrested and things like that. But they misunderstood that, a few people can't really lead a movement that transforms the whole of society. In order to transform all of society, you don't just need dozens of people. You need millions of people who are really convinced of an idea and acting acting themselves to create that new type of society that the utopians were so interested in. So we can go to the next slide. So the First International is the first big group of socialists that comes together. It's called officially the International Working Men's Association, and it started in sympathy with the Union during the Civil War. They were raising money to send to the Union cause. Lots of socialists from Europe actually fought for the Union Army because some of them had been deported or kicked out of their own countries. Um, and the ones in Britain were trying to make sure that the British government didn't help the Confederacy. And basically it included all radicals. It was a sort of big tent, and this meant that it included anarchists and socialists, which we now understand to be two somewhat diverging political viewpoints. And the main fight that was going on in the First International was, should we take political action? And by political action, I basically mean, should socialists try to interact with government at the level of like elections or making demands of the state. And the anarchist thought is the whole state is illegitimate. Yeah, the state is the thing running society right now. People don't have what they need. It's very violent. People are going hungry. They don't get paid enough. So why would we want to engage with the state? And of course, I'm being somewhat simplistic here. And the socialists at that time, and these included Marx, who was a participant in the First International. He actually sort of headed the committee and wrote many of its documents. Um, Thought, well, no, we have to uh, participate within the state in some way because it gives us a larger audience, and it sort of avoids the problems of imminent violence that direct action that the anarchists favored could invite and would lead to getting lots of people locked up. Um, and so this anarchist position eventually developed into something called syndicalism, which is the idea that you win socialism not by, trying to create a new government within the old, but instead by relying purely upon organized workers, usually organized into trade unions. Um, and eventually, when they're big enough and class consciousness and conditions are right, the trade unions would essentially just sort of take the role of government and administer society in a cooperative fashion where things are democratically accountable and goods are administered according to what people need and not just what people can afford. So those are the discussions going on in the first international, which eventually split over this question of political action. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so after the first international came, what you guessed it, the second international. It was founded in 1889, and it was comprised of parties from like 20 different countries, so all over Europe. Um, and its leading party, which is the main one I'm going to focus on, was the German Social Democratic Party, so sort of the socialist in Germany. Um, and the main thinker of the party was Karl Kautsky, who was this guy who had sort of grown up writing articles for the various newspapers that the party had. And he had actually met and corresponded with Karl Marx and Marx's collaborator, um, Friedrich Engels. And so part of the reason the German SPD is so strong is because capitalism was very developed in Germany, and so there was also a big working class. And not only that, but it was very militant working class because its life had changed so much so quickly, and so it was very ripe for class consciousness. But also because it had the main thinkers of socialism um, in that country, and they were all very concerned with the question of how to build a strong, powerful movement. And a testament to the strength of their movement was, there's an autocracy in Germany. They didn't really have an elected president, and they went from being outlawed in the 1880s to eventually being made legal because they had gotten so much support in society that the government couldn't really keep them down anymore. And the way this sort of worked was that there were bodies that were elected, but they basically had no formal power. And the uh, Kaiser didn't really have to do anything to respond to what the assemblies demanded. But still, this was an opportunity to agitate for socialism. And in particular, these uh, elected officials could not be arrested. And so, using these elections as a way to get the public message of socialism out there, even though it was illegal, was how over time the SPD was able to force the government to make it legal to be a social democrat. Otherwise their newspapers, their party meetings, these were all busted up by the authorities. So we can go to the next slide. And so now I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the SPD was like. It was active at all levels of society, and it had newspapers, trade unions, sports clubs, music clubs, drinking clubs, hiking clubs, 500 different types of clubs. If there was an activity you can think of, letter writing, probably, sewing, knitting, there's probably a club for it, which is just to say that it had a very big hold in society. And it provided social, social functions so people could gather. It had a political function, right? Because people were always reading the papers. There were, 100 daily papers basically, um, all throughout the country. And it was a sort of identity that people had. It was something that you just bumped into in your daily life. And the SPDs, and so this wasn't really this wasn't necessarily unique. Like everywhere that there's been a strong socialist movement, there have been all these various aspects and parts to it. But it was unique in its size. It was enormous. They got at one point they got the most votes in an election. Something like 34 or 38%. And so this is under not a proper democratic government, which is just to say that they had a real feel and attachment for the sentiments of the working class in that country. And their strategy was to, via the party, educate and train the working class to govern society by creating an alternative culture and organization opposed to capitalism that could win the battle of democracy. And so that's like a very nice sounding summary, but it has a few parts to it. The alternative culture is this, all these institutions related to people's recreation, but also their learning outside of school and their work, that I talked about before. Um, and, the point of this was these alternative institutions was to raise the level of political and understanding of the average person, and to the level that they were able to, as a class, govern society. When we think about the people who are in government, and we occasionally, think that they're quite dumb or hypocritical or not exactly the experts we might want them to be. Uh, Nonetheless, there are a lot of people who are, bureaucrats or politicians who have a lot of technical knowledge about what doing politics means. And so the idea of the SPD was to give the average person these skills, public speaking, writing, argumentation, debate, thinking about politics on a regular basis in a serious way. Um, and it was important that this organization was opposed to capitalism, right? You didn't just want to sort of ingratiate yourself to the existing system, but you wanted to, at every instance, claim that you wanted a new system. And the way they did that was through winning the battle of democracy, which basically meant trying to win more and more and more elected officials, who didn't see their role as making laws first and foremost, but instead of organizing the working class from their offices. They would always, attack the most reactionary legislators. And there was also a practice they had where any person could come, off the street and question one of the ministers of the government. And they used this as a way to expose all the bad things that the government was doing. So we can go to the next slide. And so some of the debates within the SPD, which are natural because any large organization will have differences of political opinion in it, were about how will socialism occur. This was kind of the first one. It's referred to as the revisionism debate. And like I said, the election results for the SPD had kept getting better. And not only that, but capitalism had kept spreading around the world. And so there was this idea that, because Marx had said that you have to have capitalism before you have socialism, um, we could just naturally, sort of very easily, gradually progress from one to the other. And the people who held that position were called revisionists. And the outcome of, or what they advocated for was basically a less confrontational approach to the government, a less confrontational approach to liberals and progressives and trade union leaders who, didn't fight militantly enough for the working class. And another debate was, should socialists participate in government? At one point, uh, there was a minister who was a socialist who was brought into the ruling government, um, and the person who was leading the government had participated in killing all of the people um, in a revolutionary uprising. And so the whole Socialist Party, the SPD, was basically very distraught at this, right? Because one of their own comrades had now given a progressive veneer to the government of someone who had mowed down, people who might have been related to them, people who they might have known. And so there was this question: how much should we try to take responsibility for the current system right now, and how much should we always try to win a majority? But if we aren't going to win a majority, vote no on everything, maintain our independence. And so, like I sort of said before, the Marxist center tendency, center as in neither left nor right, thought that the point of elected officials, first and foremost, was to propagandize, which is sometimes referred to as revolutionary parliamentarism, and not just to join government as quickly as possible, as this person I just talked about did. And then, as they got more and more people elected, there came to be these rifts between what the elected officials were doing and what the members of the party wanted, and what the trade union leaders were doing and what the members of the party wanted, and what the newspapers were printing and what the members of the party wanted. And there's all sorts of explanations that we can give for this, but it's mostly just related to how bureaucracy naturally works, which is that people who are at the top of a bureaucracy want to stay there, and they want to expand their influence, and they might get paid more than the people at the bottom. Um, and so, in an organization where you have like 4,000 paid officials for the party, which is just such a large number now for us to think about. There were these differences between the membership of the party and and some of their leaders who they were having difficulty keeping accountable. And so that's where this term democratic centralism emerges, which is, if we have a vote at a conference of the party, then it's absolutely binding on all of these leaders who we know are sometimes getting out of our control. And the center of the party should have the ability to expel these people who are in high up positions, because if they do bad things, they can make us all look bad. And then finally, there were a lot of debates on war, colonialism, and imperialism, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So the socialist movement splits in a really big way at the beginning of World War One. Basically, in Europe, which is where a lot of World War One happened. All these countries are going to war with each other, and all these countries have their own socialist parties. And so the question emerged: how do these socialist parties react to their governments declaring war? And some of these governments in Europe at the time were more democratic or less democratic, or more authoritarian or less authoritarian. And so some of the socialists thought, well, if this authoritarian country invades our democratic country, it's going to set the workers' movement back decades. So we have to support our leaders in fighting this war. And so ultimately, this is kind of supporting the boss's war, the ruling class's war, because there wasn't a particularly good reason for the war, and millions of people die, and it destroyed the continent. And but some people did, a lot of socialists did sort of stick to their internationalist convictions, including the Russians and the American parties. But this big event where people on one side of the question think that they're absolutely right, and people on the other side are viewed by the working class as to have betrayed them, leads to the formation of a new international after the second one splits, and especially after the Russian Revolution, and the sort of the leading party to which the whole world's radical working class looked moved from Germany to Russia after the Russian Revolution. So we can go to the next slide. So basically, the Russian Revolution was a long time in the making, because they had a very backwards political system. The capitalism that they did have was concentrated in cities, but many people were still peasants, and the work was quite hard. And there were almost no political freedoms. People were regularly, exiled, and all the soldiers were conscripted from a young age and beat, and they couldn't leave for 20 years. So it was very, people all around the world knew exactly how oppressive the government of Russia was. And there was a revolution in 1905 that was sort of called the dress rehearsal for the 1917 revolution. And prior to the 1905 revolution, Lenin had written an important pamphlet, and that pamphlet was called "What is to be Done." And the basic idea of what is to be done is that, uh, in Germany, this model of the SPD is working very well. Uh, and we need to implement it here because we need to democratize the state. They were able to force their government to make them legal. We should be able to do that here so that we're not always getting exiled. Um, and people really really love this pamphlet, and it took off in strides. And the idea was really that the socialists need to connect all the active layers of the working class movement. People were going on strike all the time, and they need to go to those workers and convince them that in order to uh, live better lives, they have to overthrow the czar. um, and so that's sort of what I mean by previous debates in Russia were the same as elsewhere. They had the same problems controlling some of their leaders. They had the same problems relating to trade unions. Um, but a different point, though, is that like I said before, all of the radical working class movements around the world, they looked to Russia. Um, but this became a problem when the Civil War happened. So they have the revolution, and then there's a civil war because a big chunk of the country, mostly some peasants, but lots and lots of the rich people, the capitalists, the people who are part of the royal family, they don't want to, give in to the communists. And there were also foreign governments that invaded to help them. And so during this time, in order to basically keep control of the territory that they did have and make sure that society was working and people were fed and that the war was being won. This political party that had previously existed underground and was accustomed to great repression had to turn into essentially a sort of military party where there was iron discipline of the members and orders were handed down from above. During very sensitive times, right? If you have a battle, you can't sort of necessarily sit around and discuss for a long time what needs to do, right? A decision has to be made, and then everyone has to get after it. But the problem with this is that the militarized party model is exported all around the world, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So the third international, formed after the second one fell apart, is called the Comintern, the Communist International. It's an abbreviation for that. It was different than the previous two. It had this sort of military structure around the world. They were sort of marching uh, towards world revolution, which they thought was about to break out. And they supported the national liberation struggles of people around the world. Lots of colonial peoples fought for European countries in World War One, but were still being exploited at home. And so, whereas people said that the Second International had its strongest support in Europe, the Comintern was said to be for people whose skin was darker shades than white. Um, and some of the debates going on in the Comintern at the time uh, were about ultra-leftism and insurrection. So in 1917, the Russian Revolution had happened, and they had overthrown the government with soldiers. And other places thought they should do that, particularly in German at a time called the March Action. But really, they didn't have the support of the whole working class. And so this was really um, a mistake, and they were put down and defeated. And so this is what I sort of mean by ultra leftism, the desire to sort of make a revolution too quickly without the support of the people. Um, Later on, they thought, we're in the period of world revolution. Um, and so in the meantime, these people who had supported the war kind of developed into their own distinct current, and they now call themselves social democrats. Um, and the idea of the Comintern, which was quite misguided, was that these social democrats are now social fascists. They are the first enemies we have to overcome in order to win socialism because they mislead the working class, unlike us. And you can understand how ridiculous this might be in some ways by thinking about the United States, where it would be really odd for us to think that the main barrier to socialism is progressives, right? The main barrier to socialism right now is probably that just not enough people know it is. Um, and going along with this meant that instead of participating in the regular trade unions, um, the Comintern decided to set up its own red unions. And basically, what this meant is that the communist workers were all isolated from the rest of the workers. And so they couldn't really spread their message of class struggle to the organized working class. So this line was really not a very good strategy. And then finally, there was well, not finally, but there was a sort of middle strategy that they decided on called the United Front, which meant working with social democrats, but still criticizing them when you had common goals and where you disagreed with them, and boring from within, which was this idea that we don't start our own unions, we work within the existing unions and try to win people over to our ideas without, just wrecking things or being radical for being radical's sake. But once Nazi Germany came around and presented, uh, one second, sorry, Nazi Germany came around and represented a existential threat to the Soviet Union. They came up with the idea of the Popular Front, which was the idea that the Soviet Union is about to be invaded and destroyed. And in response to that, you had to ally with everyone to the left of the fascists, which essentially meant that you form alliances and coalitions with the liberals. And this, in effect, meant that the communists sort of liquidated themselves. They had no independent identity. And so this, too, was a big problem, and especially in the United States, where this basically meant that the Communist Party, once very big and very militant, sort of subordinated itself to the Democratic Party, which later on made it easier to purge from public life in the labor movement. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've gone to World War II. We've gone to a bunch of different approaches inside the labor movement, outside the labor movement. Don't get people elected, get people elected. And really these we can sort of think about these different positions on various questions as, sort of toolbox or just the options we have before us potentially. It's an array of things that people tried in the past. And there haven't been too many innovations on it since, mostly because with the United States becoming the dominant power in the world and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the socialist movement and especially the trade union movement and the organized working class have been on the retreat in most of the places where they were once very strong. One of the things that enabled this in a way was that the Comintern was essentially an organization that gave orders to people all over the world, and they listened because the party in Moscow gave them money. But this meant that local activists, local communists, didn't really develop their own independent capacities to judge the political situation, and people were always being purged, and favorite leaders would be moved around into different positions, and people would be iced out. And so really there wasn't this sort of internal democracy that allows the class to learn to govern as a class. At the same time as for instance, the US socialist movement was receding, though, there was armed struggle all over the third world, Latin America, Vietnam, and Asia, Cuba, places like Angola, South Africa, as countries that had once been occupied by imperialist powers, wanted to realize once more this promise that had come after World War II, that nations ought to be equal to each other. And communist parties at the same time, because of this bureaucratism, and because in some places they had become integrated into the political system, they became less oppositional. They stopped calling for the immediate overthrow of capitalism and instead tried to build up coalitions that could gradually over time, win majorities of society for understandable reasons, right? The whole world had just suffered a world war. And the collapse of militant labor movements and reformism is really, I should say, the collapse of militant labor movements is what led to this kind of reformism. when everyone is going on strike all the time, as was happening, around the turn of the century, it's very easy to have uh, high hopes for a revolution right around the corner. But when uh, the labor movement is very slow to move and isn't striking as much, um, your horizon, narrows. And so I've written here, social movements plus political parties plus the labor movement um, is the sort of like formula that I think people we have to work from today. And by that, I basically mean, we don't have an exact idea of how we're going to take power, but we know it probably involves running in elections or a big organization, a political party. It probably involves people in the streets talking about police violence and racial and gender discrimination. And it probably involves workers organizing at the point of production and going on strike. And, we can look back at the history since World War II, and our recent moment really stands out to us, right? Because lots of workers are now going on strike again. In the last 3 or 4 years, um, ever since the great financial crisis, we've had Occupy, Black Lives Matter, 2 presidential campaigns of Bernie Sanders, and lots of people are talking about the word socialism. There are these new populist movements in Latin America and in Europe that are once again talking in a credible way about the problems with our economic and social system. Um, and hopefully, some of the things that I have talked about will appear to you as tools that we can, try to figure out what to do with our DSA chapter.
All right. And so before we move on to the next section, we realize that this is a lot of content that's been thrown out at you. So we kind of just want to pause for a second and maybe open the floor to anyone who might have any questions, any comments, or anything that you would like to further discuss. Feel free, since we don't have a huge group, just feel free to unmute yourself, or if you're more comfortable with typing in the chat. So Rolf says, what's the relation between ultra-leftism and vanguardism?
Yeah, that's a good question. So some of the Um, so the Bolsheviks, the Russian Revolutionary Party, um, they were quite their ideas about socialism and revolution were quite mainstream in 1917 because they had taken the sort of obvious correct stance against the war. Um, Over time, sort of as the fate of the Soviet Union, as it went the way it did, and as the Comintern sort of degenerated into a lot of bureaucratic parties, unfortunately. These terms from the Russian revolutionary experience uh, were sort of exported in um, a way without context, such that they didn't apply. And so one of these ideas is this idea of vanguardism, which today there's a lot of, they call themselves Stalinist or Trotskyist groups. There's a handful of them in the United States, and they have a few hundred members at best. And this is sort of the history of the far left for the last 20 or 30 years until DSA came around, is these very small sects. Um, and their idea of revolution is, to sort of summarize in a short way that we have the the know-how to make a revolution because we've been studying these works, and we just need to find the political line and the political struggles that will link us up with the workers so that they'll follow us, and then we'll make a socialist revolution. And so that's, that's the sort of caricature of vanguardism. But there's another side of vanguardism which just says that um, in any organization, some people are going to be more active than others. We have a lot of people in the DSA chapter, but then there's also a steering committee, right, who do stuff on a daily basis. And this is true of the working class at large, right? Like some groups of workers are going on strike more than others. They're just more militant right now for whatever reason. And um, the initial way that leadership of the working class was talked about was just that, look, there are objectively these militant workers out there, and we want them to be in our party so that we can all lead the socialist revolution. Um, and so it wasn't an unrepresentative um, an unrepresentative act to make a revolution if you had all these militant workers on board, because they were just the top layer of all of these people who were just less active, but sort of supported them and had the same sort of ideas. And this is just kind of like a fact about politics in general, right? Like you can't make a political system that's based on everyone participating all the time, right? Because people get bored, people want to do other stuff. Some people are fine not participating. Um, and so, yeah, there's this sort of like far left caricature of Vanguard, and then there's, sort of, I guess, the commonsensical or sociological idea of the Vanguard.
Yeah, so thanks for that question. That was a really great answer, Griffin. All right, so I mean, if no one else has any questions or any comments that they would like to make, and again, you're welcome to ask any questions at any time in the chat. We're gonna go ahead and keep on rolling. I think we realize that we have a lot more content than we might have time to present, but we're gonna try and get through as much of this as we can. So in the next section, we're going to look at different models of socialism and some of the basic principles. So in the last session, in Socialism 101, we looked at these basic principles of socialism. So what do we mean when we talk about socialism as an economic and political system? And so, we define these, basic principles. The means of production are owned collectively. And, what do we mean by the means of production? These are the instruments of labor, the things that the tools, the machinery, the buildings, everything we need in order to produce what we need, as well as the subjects of labor. So these are the raw materials and resources. So under capitalism, all of these means of production are owned by a very small group of capitalists. Under socialism, these same means of productions would be owned collectively. And again, that can take many different forms. So it's a more democratic system, where workers control their workplaces. Goods and services are produced not for profit, but to satisfy needs. And the surplus value, so basically what we consider profits, excess revenue, wealth that is created by workers that does not go back to the workers. Under socialism, this would be the case. Or at least, workers would receive the benefits directly in some way. And everyone has an access and right to basic goods like, healthcare, employment if they want it, education, etc. And so, as I mentioned, and apologies for the talk again. So Marx and Engels, didn't really write a whole lot on how a socialist society might be organized, because capitalism was still in an early phase. They were brilliant at diagnosing the inherent problems they saw of capitalism, which was all the more remarkable given that it was still in this early phase. But they really left questions about what to do, or what it would look like once we replaced capitalism. They really left this to future generations to solve. Um, and so, just to further break down some of the basic distinctions between, capitalism and socialism, again, who controls the means of production? As I said, under capitalism, it's private ownership. Socialism, it's collectivized. How are resources allocated and goods and services distributed? Well, in our society today, it's entirely, based upon a quote unquote free market. Whereas in socialism, there would be, this element of planning, intentional planning. And again, that too can take very many different forms. Some forms of socialism are, complete top-down, 100% planned. Other forms of socialism might include limited markets in some cases. And so what determines production? Again, under capitalism, profit is what drives everything, really. Any social good that is derived from commodities or from services produced under capitalism, is really secondary to the profit that can be extracted. Whereas in socialism, or any kind of socialist system that wants to call itself socialism, production should be determined by how useful it is, how beneficial it is to society. And again, who receives surplus value? In capitalism, all the gains, all the capital gains, all the, returns on investment go directly to, this very tiny, relatively tiny group of owners. And they're managers of capital, which is another way of saying CEOs and executives. And under socialism, we would want surplus capital to return and benefit the workers. And so, to further break down, what are the different factors of, any socialist system? And again, a disclaimer here is that, we can in no way come close to covering all forms of socialism. There are many attributes, that overlap. Um, we are just looking at very broad areas of distinction. But within each of these areas, there are, many models and ways of, achieving this, and any future socialist system is probably going to have to, be some kind of hybrid system. We're going to look at some historical models in a little bit. But, basically, the two key things are, who owns the means of production, or how is that owned by the workers? Is it owned by, a quote unquote worker state, or we could also refer to that as public ownership. We kind of have some form of that today in capitalist societies, which we call nationalized industries. Think of things like, the post office, utilities in some places, transportation in some places, not here, not necessarily here in the United States. And we do have Amtrak, but, in other countries, they have very robust transportation systems that are actually owned by the state. You know, this is in a socialist state system, everything would be nationalized. Whereas collective ownership, the means of production are owned by the workers. And this too can take many different forms. You can have, worker co-ops, which we also have some examples of in capitalist economies, where the workers, literally own their workplace. They hold shares. They receive the profits directly, and collectivized workplaces, which we are going to look at some interesting examples in a little bit. And then how is the economy planned? Is this done at the very top levels, through some kind of central, economic organization? Or is it decentralized where, decisions are made with input, or directly by workers, at the local, regional level, etc. And so we're going to start with the state ownership, which, fortunately or unfortunately, is probably the one that most people think of when they think of socialism, the big bad Soviet Union. Um, but whatever you might think of the Soviet Union, it was an example of state ownership plus central economic planning. It was a very highly centralized command economy. All economic planning, all investment, all allocation of capital was controlled by the state. The Soviet Central Planning Committee was an organization or government department called Gosplan. They issued what were called 5-year plans, which maybe some of you have heard of. There were many 5-year plans that were that were issued throughout the lifespan of the Soviet Union, which basically, outlined goals, targets for different industries. Many of these plans were concluded before the 5 years because they had achieved their goals. Although, of course, the veracity of the data and reporting was always questionable at best. But it's an oversimplification to talk about the Soviet economy as this monolithic thing. The USSR went through various phases, swinging between total state control. For example, during the war communist phase, as Griffin talked about, the militarization of the economy and the party, which in many ways was done out of necessity. They had no other choice. It was this existential threat from the Nazis and fascists. Um, and then there was also some degree of economic liberalization, and pretty early on too. Lenin introduced what was called the New Economic Policy in 1921, as an attempt to jumpstart the economy, which had just been destroyed by the Russian Revolution. That was later reversed by Stalin. And then, of course, later on in the 70s and 80s, there were more, a return to this kind of, these kind of market reforms. But again, whatever, you might think about the Soviet Union, and we're not going to apologize, for everything that they've done, but, what cannot be denied is that, Russia went from being one of the most backward countries in the West. Marx himself even said that Russia was probably the country least likely to have a socialist revolution because, they believed that there had to be some kind of industrialization first that Russia just did not have. They were essentially a feudal state. Um, and so they went from being, this feudal peasant state to a global superpower in just a matter of a few decades. They had virtually no unemployment, high standard of living at the time when the rest of the world was going through the Great Depression. Um, but, it was a form of state socialism. Some people might even call it state capitalism, where the workers did not really control the means of production. Officially, the state and the Revolutionary Party, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which nominally represented the workers. They said they represented the workers. They controlled the means of production, and they had control of planning and allocation of resources. And so the word Soviet in Russian just means council. It can refer to any governmental council. In fact, it's still used in Russia today. The word is still used. But at the time of the revolution, the Soviets were basically workers' councils. They predate the revolution. The first ones go back all the way, or they predate the 1917 revolution. Russia actually had a revolution in 1905 that failed. But that's when the Soviets first started to emerge, and they were kind of, they were kind of like trade unions. They were political organizations of workers that organized direct action and strikes against the czar and the empire. Um, and so, pre-revolutionary Russia is, this really fascinating place. There were lots of debates, as we would see during the first international that Griffin talked about, how do we achieve socialism? How is the party structured? What is the role of these worker councils? There were fierce debates. Ultimately, the Bolsheviks came out on top. For most of this period, they were not the majority party. They did not have that much power, but really, came to the front during the revolution under the leadership of Lenin. And so, we're going to look at a couple of very complicated, although very nice looking diagrams. And so this is, without looking too much into the details, this is more or less how this gives a good picture literally of how the Soviets were organized at the height of the Soviet Union. So it went all the way down to the level of individual factories and workplaces who had councils that represented each firm. And, the workers would then send representatives up this hierarchy to, district Soviets, county and regional Soviets. And all of these fell under what was called the Supreme Soviets. Um, And the Soviet Union was actually the reason it's called a union is because it was made up of these different constituent republics, which you can kind of see here around the crest. So, a lot of these correspond to countries that exist today, like Georgia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Ukraine, etc. And Russia itself was, just one. It's this one down here, the Russian Socialist Soviet, or the Russian Soviet Socialist Federation. And so, all of these republics, had their supreme Soviet. You can almost kind of think of it like as a state government that then fell under the umbrella of the Congress of Soviets. And so elected representatives from each level, or representatives were elected at each level to serve at the next highest level. So, I mean, in theory, it was, something like a representative democracy, and could have been. This was more or less the system that was in place until 1936, when a new constitution was passed under Stalin. It's oftentimes known as the Stalin Constitution. This formally established the Soviet Union as a one-party state. It officially introduced some democratic reforms like direct elections. Um, so in some way they almost tried to pass it off as a democratization reform, because instead of this representational system, you now had direct elections, as we see in this diagram. So now the workers and the peasants directly elect the representatives at each level. So on paper it looked good, but in practice these were largely uncontested elections. The Constitution dissolved the Congress of Soviets. They replaced it with, you could say, the ultimate Supreme Soviet at the very top. And so, it'd be like if you replaced the parliamentary system with the strong presidential system. All of the power lay with the secretary of the party, and then the party was basically fused with the government, officially at this point. And so, to look at an interesting, contrasting example from history, we can look at revolutionary Spain. You might be somewhat familiar, at least heard of, the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, in which reactionary elements of the Spanish upper classes, the military rebelled against the Republican state that had just replaced the monarchy. But, what's not talked about as much is what's termed by historians as the Spanish Revolution, which was going on at the same time, particularly in Catalonia, but also in other parts of Spain. And so just to give a little bit of background context, there was a Republican government that was based in Madrid, that had come to power in 1932. It kicked out the monarchy. And so Spain was now a republic. This was the second time in its history. So it's often called the Second Republic. The government was a center-left sort of social democratic party or government that had support of the Socialist Party, called the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, that still exists today. Despite its very radical sounding name, it is not, and even at the time back then, it was more radical during the 1930s, but even then it wasn't the most radical party in Spain. They were flanked to their left by the Comintern-aligned Communist Party. There was a dissident Communist Party known as the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, which was made kind of famous because George Orwell, when he went to fight in the Civil War, joined a militia. They're called the POUM, by their acronym POUM. And so he wrote about them in homage to Catalonia. And then, of course, there were the anarchists. And so in 1936, there was a general election. The Republican Socialist Coalition defeated the right-wing coalition. That's another interesting thing that most people don't realize, is that there was actually a right-wing government in power during the Republic, for 2 years. And then they were defeated again in 1936. They were quasi-fascist, more of a Catholic nationalist, traditionalist party, but still very reactionary, very conservative. And so at this point, after being in power for 2 years, they had tried to undo all of the reforms and gains of the first Republican administration. And so when they lost in 1936, they basically, gave up on electoral politics and said, this is not the path. We are revolutionaries, and that's when they launched their coup. That was a conspiracy of right-wing generals. And so in response, you had socialists, anarchists, communists, um, trade unions, nationalists from the Basque Country and Catalonia join in this coalition, this popular front. And so even though they all had slightly different interests, they recognized that, their primary goal was to defend the Republic at all costs. And so, this was a very much a prelude to the Second World War. It often gets overlooked. Um, again, I would love to do an entire session just on the Spanish Civil War, but we are actually over time now. um, but we hope that you stick with us a little bit, because this is a really interesting example from history. A really interesting snapshot, and this is Madrid. Madrid was on the front lines of the Civil War, so it didn't really have the opportunity to experiment in the way that Barcelona did. Barcelona had long been a stronghold of the anarchist trade union called the CNT, which you can see here in the sign. That's the National Confederation of Labor, and they still exist today, although they are much reduced from their height of power back in the 20s and 30s. And so in Barcelona, the military coup was put down pretty quickly compared to other parts of Spain, as well as in the neighboring states. And so they were kind of insulated from the front lines of the war. And so what that meant was that, they were able to sort of undertake these experiments in workers' control, rather than just focusing entirely on winning the war. And so they began this project of collectivizing workplaces all across the city. You can see this is one of the fanciest hotels that I believe still exists, on La Rambla, which is the famous street in Barcelona. It was collectivized. It was a joint effort by the CNT, which was the anarchist trade union, and the UGT, which was the socialist trade union. Even though they were fierce rivals before the war, they put their differences aside, at least for a little bit, and co-collectivized um, parts of Barcelona. Um, and so, as Griffin mentioned before, this is what's known as syndicalism. So the workplaces were taken over and operated by the unions. This started almost immediately when the war broke out. In places like Spain that were held by the Republic, oftentimes bosses and owners just fled. They left to France or to other parts of Spain that were held by the nationalists. And so in many cases, the workers had no choice but to take over, to take matters into their own hands, literally. In some cases, workplaces that were owned by former fascists were physically expropriated. In some cases, bosses and administrators were allowed to remain in their posts, but this was just entirely for their technical expertise. And so the unions were the ones that controlled, the workplaces. And again, these were, the anarchist and the socialist unions. They worked with the government of Catalonia, which was called the Generalitat. And so they decreed officially that all firms with more than 100 employees must be collectivized. And they also had a sort of hierarchical structure of councils, similar to what the Soviet Union had. Each individual workplace was run by a committee of workers that were elected. These committees were grouped by industry, so manufacturing, textiles, the service industry, etc., under what was called the General Council of Industry. And then these all fell under the Economic Council of the state. And so, these were composed of representatives, representatives from the workplaces as well as the unions, technicians and experts. And their function was to regulate the production of each industry. And to unify the prices, set the prices. They studied consumption levels, in order to make decisions on whether to increase or decrease the number of, say, factories, to administer the purchase and distribution of raw materials, and so forth. So these industrial councils really did the bulk of the legwork, and these are the middle level. So rather than it being entirely top down, it was decentralized. The economic council at the very top, um, its function was really just to collect, the excess profits, and then to redistribute them to workers, to redistribute them, to, less profitable industries. Just naturally some industries are going to be more profitable than others. And so they were sort of the redistributive mechanism, whereas the general councils really did, the bulk of the legwork. And so, this rate of collectivization, it varied all over the country. It didn't just happen in Barcelona, but this is where, it was really most prominent. At its height, 3/4 of all industry in the city was collectivized. And again, this ranged from, factories to barbershops, to movie theaters, restaurants. The transportation system was collectivized. And so, in contrast, though, to the Soviet Union, these collectives were voluntary and they were bottom up. Um, Business owners were actually given the opportunity to join voluntarily. That is, of course, if the workers didn't force the issue using force. In practice, any enterprise who refused to join a collective, or a tenant farmer who wanted to go it alone, didn't want to join a collective, had that option. They just had a much harder time, for example, finding buyers or accessing markets or distributing their goods. Just like in capitalism today, you can decide to go at it on your own, but you're going to face some difficulties. It was kind of the same thing. And there were attempts to replace money with vouchers, to varying degrees of success. These were primarily for consumer goods, and non-essential services. Essential goods were basically free. You didn't need money, you didn't need vouchers. George Orwell actually writes some interesting things about his observations when he was in Barcelona during the war. So I highly recommend that if you haven't checked it out. This is actually a picture from Madrid. You can see, the CNT and the FAI, which was kind of a wing of the CNT. It was the more radical wing. It was the Iberian Anarchist Federation. They, literally would take the trucks, from former military bases, or confiscate the former municipal trucks, and put them at the service of the workers and the common people. And you can see it was a very jubilant time too. There was a lot of excitement in the air, even though there was the existential threat just literally outside the city. And so the lessons I think to take away from from this period in time, even though it was unfortunately short-lived, because the fascists did win the war in the end. But we can look at the lessons in this experiment. Compared to a centralized state ownership like in the Soviet Union, the means of production were controlled more directly by the workers. It was a bit more transparently democratic, but the workers still did not directly own the means of production. You know, these kinds of collectives were opposed by socialists and communists who wanted a more nationalized system. The communists were opposed to this project entirely, actually, because they thought that the left should focus on just defeating fascism, and then get to revolution. So, it's this interesting dynamic where, the communists were not the most radical elements, and in many ways were kind of reactionary at the time. But so these viewpoints on syndicalization, sorry, hard word, differ even amongst anarchists. Some of the more radical anarchists thought that the unions, must own as well as possess the enterprises, and that no state is necessary. They disagreed with the anarchists, even collaborating with the state. An interesting side note in history is that there were anarchists in Barcelona who were actually elected to government. It's the only time in history where there have been anarchists that have served in a government. Um, so there are a lot of, that was a very polarizing action, although, some people would say it was necessary at the time in order to get this done. Um, and so, but again, this still wasn't a true worker state. You know, on the one hand, the workers did have representation in the state, but according to true anarchism, the workers must own and operate the industries directly, through the union, not through these representational councils. And if the republic had been successfully defended, perhaps this path could have been explored, but unfortunately, we will never know. And so, these are just some lessons to take away as, an example of cooperative ownership, which, is more in line with the system that, aligns with democratic socialism, rather than having this, very top down, heavy state apparatus, we would want something that is more decentralized, but still in a way that allows coordination at a high level. So really, the question is how to balance the two. You want workers to have as much control as possible, but, when you get down into, that very, individual enterprise level, it makes it very hard, to plan things, and so in the case of Catalonia, they kind of tried to thread the needle between these two systems. And it worked for a while. It was successful, but we'll never know how that experiment would have played out over time, unfortunately.